Picture this for a moment. A tiny village on the western edge of Ireland. The Atlantic is roaring. The wind is slamming into stone walls like it wants to tear the whole place apart. Rain is falling sideways. The paths are deep with mud. The sea is violent. The fields are soaked. Night is coming early. And inside a small cottage, a family is gathered around one weak fire, hoping it lasts until morning. No central heating. No supermarket. No delivery truck coming tomorrow. No phone to call for help. No easy way out. Just cold. Wet. Hunger. And one question hanging over everything. How do you survive this, with almost nothing? That is what makes old Irish villages so powerful to think about. When we look back, it is easy to see poverty. It is easy to see rough homes, hard lives, and people who seem to have very little. But if you look closer, you begin to see something else. You see strategy. You see discipline. You see knowledge. You see a kind of survival intelligence that was built over generations. Because these villages were not just sitting there, suffering in the weather. They were fighting it every single day. And the truth is, the weather in Ireland was not just an inconvenience. It was an enemy that never really left. It was in the wind that ripped across the coast. It was in the damp cold that crept into clothes, beds, bones, and food stores. It was in the storms that flooded land, wrecked fishing days, and turned simple travel into risk. It was in the long winters, in the failed crops, in the salt air, in the isolation. For many villages, harsh weather was not some dramatic event that happened once a year. It was life itself. That is the first thing we have to understand. These people were not surviving one disaster. They were surviving a constant condition. The weather shaped what they built, what they ate, how they worked, how they slept, how they raised children, and how they thought about tomorrow. And yet, somehow, many of these communities endured for generations. So what was their secret? One answer begins with the homes themselves. To modern eyes, old Irish cottages can look painfully simple. Small stone buildings. Tiny windows. Low roofs. Thick walls. Dirt or stone floors. Little space. Very little luxury. But that simplicity was not weakness. It was a design for survival. Those thick walls helped hold warmth. The small windows kept out wind and reduced heat loss. The low shape of the house made it harder for Atlantic storms to tear at the roof. Even the compact interior mattered. A smaller space was easier to warm, easier to protect, and easier to manage when fuel was scarce. What looked poor from the outside was often a form of practical intelligence. These homes were built by people who had learned hard lessons. They knew what the wind could do. They knew what damp could do. They knew that beauty meant nothing if a roof could not survive a storm. So they built for endurance, not appearance. And even then, the house itself was only half the battle. Because a shelter means little if you cannot keep it warm. That is why the fire mattered so much. In many Irish village homes, the hearth was everything. It was where food was cooked. It was where clothes were dried. It was where stories were told. It was where people gathered for warmth, for light, and sometimes for hope. A weak fire could mean a miserable night. No fire could mean real danger. And here is what makes that even more remarkable. In many areas, wood was not easy to get in large amounts. So people turned to what the land gave them. Peat. Turf. Cut from bogs, dried carefully, stacked, protected, and burned when needed. This was not just fuel. This was survival stored in solid form. Imagine the effort behind that. Going out into wet land. Cutting the peat. Drying it in uncertain weather. Carrying it home. stacking it for the future, protecting it from getting ruined. Every piece mattered. Every bit of fuel represented labor, foresight, and one more chance to stay warm when the worst weather arrived. And once you understand that, a simple fire no longer looks simple. It becomes the center of the whole struggle. But warmth alone could not keep a village alive. People also had to eat. And this is where the story becomes even more intense, because food in these places was never something to take for granted. When weather turns against you, food becomes fragile. A long wet spell can damage crops. Storms can affect fishing. Cold and damp can ruin storage. A bad harvest could push an entire community toward fear. And when you are already living close to the edge, there is very little space between just enough and not enough. So village life depended on foods that could last, foods that could stretch, and foods that made sense in a harsh land. Potatoes, when they were available and successful, became a vital staple because they could feed many people from small plots. Oats were important. Bread and porridge mattered. Salted fish could carry people through rougher periods. Butter, milk, broth, and simple stews helped families make the most of what little they had. This was not a world of abundance. It was a world of management. Every potato mattered. Every bit of meal mattered. Every stored item mattered. Waste was dangerous. And that changes the way people think. In modern life, inconvenience can feel like suffering. But in these villages, suffering had a much clearer shape. It could look like an empty shelf in winter. It could sound like the wind outside while the family counted the remaining food indoors. It could feel like parents trying to hide their fear from their children. And still, the villages found ways to go on. Why? Because survival did not depend only on a house or a field or a food store. It depended on people. One of the most powerful truths about Irish village survival is that nobody truly made it alone. In places with very few resources, community became a form of protection. If one roof needed repair, hands came to help. If one family was struggling, neighbors noticed. If weather cut people off, it was shared together. This was not charity in the modern sense. It was deeper than that. It was mutual survival. People shared labor. They shared information. They shared tools. They shared warnings. They shared food when possible. They shared emotional strength. A widow, an elderly man, a family hit by bad luck, or a home damaged in a storm could not simply be ignored, because in a small village, everyone's survival was tied together. And that may be one of the most beautiful parts of the story. These villages had almost nothing by modern standards. But what they had, they used together. That does not mean village life was romantic or easy. It was not. There was hardship, tension, and exhaustion. But when conditions are brutal, community stops being a nice idea and becomes a lifeline. And then there was another survival tool, one that modern people often underestimate. Attention. The villagers paid attention to the land. They watched the sky, the wind, the sea, and the animals. They noticed small changes. They learned patterns. They knew which clouds meant trouble. They knew when air felt different. They knew when to protect what they had, when to move fast, and when to stay close to home. This kind of knowledge did not come from a weather app. It came from memory, experience, and repetition. It came from living so closely with the natural world that ignoring it was impossible. That meant survival was not only about strength. It was about awareness. A person who could read the weather had an advantage. A family that prepared before the storm had a better chance. A village that respected signs in the sea or sky could avoid mistakes that might cost them dearly. And maybe that is part of what feels so striking today. These people did not master nature. They knew they could not. But they learned how to listen to it. There is humility in that. And there is wisdom in it too. But even that was not enough on its own, because harsh weather does not just attack the body. It attacks the mind. Day after day of cold, uncertainty, and struggle can wear people down. It can fill a house with worry. It can make the future feel heavy. So how did they keep going emotionally? Part of the answer lies in faith and tradition. In many Irish villages, faith was not something separate from daily life. It was woven into the way people endured it. Prayer was not abstract. It was practical comfort. Blessings mattered. Rituals mattered. Holy days mattered. In a world where storms could not be controlled and hardship could not always be explained, belief gave people meaning and strength. And alongside formal religion, folklore lived too. Old sayings. Local warnings. Protective customs. Stories tied to land, weather, and the unseen. Some of these may sound strange to modern ears, but they served a purpose. They gave people language for fear. They gave shape to mystery. They helped communities process danger and uncertainty. When the storm outside felt bigger than you, belief could keep despair from becoming the final truth. That mattered more than we might think. Because survival is never only physical. A village can have food and fuel and still collapse emotionally if hope disappears. These communities endured partly because they preserved something inward, not just outward. And that inner strength had to be passed on. Children in these villages were not raised in comfort. From an early age, they were learning survival without even calling it that. They watched adults repair roofs, gather fuel, protect food, manage animals, and read the weather. They learned not from lectures, but from life itself. A child learned how to carry, store, observe, and endure. They learned that weather was serious. They learned that work mattered. They learned that preparation mattered. They learned that complaining changed nothing. They learned that people around them depended on each other. In other words, resilience became cultural. It was passed down through action, through habit, through routine. That is one reason villages could survive for so long. Survival knowledge was not locked inside one expert. It lived inside the community. But now comes a deeper and more painful truth. Even with all this toughness, many Irish villages were still vulnerable. And the harshest lesson of all is that weather was often not the only threat. Sometimes it was not even the final one. Because what truly pushed many villages toward collapse was the way weather worked together with poverty, land pressure, hunger, disease, and later emigration. A community can survive terrible storms. It can survive poor soil. It can survive isolation. But when those things are joined by social and economic pressure, survival becomes harder and harder. That is why this story should not be reduced to simple rugged romance. These villages were strong, yes. But many were also carrying unbearable weight. A bad season in a poor village was not just inconvenience. It could deepen misery. Limited land could trap families in hardship. Repeated difficulty could break morale. And for many, the final answer was not victory over the weather. It was departure. Leaving for towns. Leaving for Britain. Leaving for America. Leaving behind homes that had stood against wind and rain for generations. That is one of the saddest parts of the story. Sometimes the weather did not defeat the village directly. It simply exposed how little margin people had left. And yet, even in that sadness, there is something deeply moving. Because these communities lasted far longer than many people today would imagine. They adapted with almost no modern technology. They built homes that could endure. They learned to use the land. They stored fuel. They stretched food. They shared burdens. They passed down knowledge. They fought for warmth, for dignity, and for one more season. That kind of endurance deserves respect. And maybe it also forces us to ask a hard question. What have we lost? We live in a world of convenience. Heat comes at the push of a button. Food appears under bright supermarket lights. Weather warnings arrive on screens. Roads connect us. Machines help us. Systems support us. And that is good. Of course it is. But many people today are strangely fragile in other ways. We are often disconnected from the land. Disconnected from practical skills. Disconnected from neighbors. Disconnected from patience. Disconnected from the quiet discipline that comes from having to prepare carefully for hard times. Old Irish villages had very little. But they understood things many modern people barely think about. They understood that shelter matters more than appearance. That fuel must be respected. That food security is serious. That community is not optional in hard times. That nature must be observed. That mental and spiritual endurance can be just as important as physical survival. And that resilience is not a feeling. It is a way of life. That does not mean we should romanticize suffering. But it does mean there is something worth learning here. Because when you strip away modern comfort, what remains? Human beings. Their habits. Their courage. Their relationships. Their ability to adapt. That is the real story of how Irish villages survived harsh weather with almost nothing. Not because they were lucky. Not because life was simple. Not because the weather was kinder than it seemed. But because ordinary people became experts at endurance. They turned cottages into shields. Peat into warmth. Scraps into meals. Neighbors into safety nets. Memory into knowledge. Belief into strength. And almost nothing, into just enough. So the next time you think about an old Irish village, do not just picture a beautiful ruin or a lonely cottage under grey skies. Picture the struggle inside it. Picture the hands that built it, repaired it, warmed it, and kept it alive. Picture the mothers stretching food, the fathers cutting fuel, the children learning by watching, the old people reading the weather, the neighbors helping each other before the storm reached its worst. That is where the real power is. Not in the romance of the past, but in the resilience of the people who lived it. And maybe that is why these villages still speak to us now. Because deep down, we know this is not just a story about weather. It is a story about what human beings can do when life gives them very little, but they refuse to give up. If you enjoyed this journey into forgotten Irish life, and you want more stories about Irish history, village traditions, hidden survival wisdom, and the deeper truths behind everyday life, make sure you subscribe. And let me ask you this in the comments: which part surprised you most? The design of the homes, the power of the hearth, the way food was stretched, or the way entire communities survived by standing together? I would love to hear your thoughts.